the galaxy had forgotten Earth. Once, humanity had stood among the stars, fierce and unyielding, but time had a way of erasing memories. Empires rose and fell, and the name of mankind faded into myth. The Zelver Dominion ruled now, an empire built on conquest, its fleets unstoppable, its soldiers ruthless. The weak were crushed, the strong enslaved, and resistance was met with annihilation. On a forgotten world in the Outer Rim, the last remnants of Earth's warriors toiled in the mines of Eurythus. They were broken, their weapons long lost, their spirits worn thin by centuries of servitude. The Zelver overlords mocked them, calling them relics of a dead past. But the fire had never gone out. It smoldered in their hearts, waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a dying Zelver officer. He was dragged into the mines, bleeding out, his ornate armor shattered. A rebellion had erupted in the neighboring system, and the Dominion was stretched thin. The officer gasped out orders, demanding aid, but the humans merely watched. Then one of them stepped forward. His name was Darius Kane, a soldier from Earth's final wars. He knelt beside the Zelver, pressing a firm hand to the wound. The officer sneered. "You think to save me, human?" Darius leaned in. "No. I think to take back what's mine." With a single twist, he ended the officer's life. The Zelver guards turned their weapons on him, but it was too late. The miners surged forward, years of rage unleashed in an instant. They fought with fists, with stolen tools, with anything they could find. The guards fell, their arrogance their undoing. Within minutes, the mine belonged to the humans. Darius stood over the officer's body and stripped away the armor. The weight of it felt familiar, like the days when Earth's warriors had marched into battle unafraid. He turned to the others. "We were once legends," he said. "The galaxy thinks we are extinct. Let's remind them who we are." The humans armed themselves with whatever they could scavenge. The mine tunnels became their stronghold, the captured weapons their lifeline. They sent out scouts, seeking out more of their kind. What they found shocked them. Humans were everywhere. Scattered across the Dominion, they lived in chains, their history erased, their strength forgotten even to themselves. But they remembered now. One by one, hidden messages spread across the Zelver-controlled systems. The old ways were whispered in the dark. Names lost to time were spoken once more. Kane rallied the first fighters, striking at the Dominion in sudden, brutal attacks. Zelver garrisons were wiped out before they even knew there was a war. The Dominion laughed at first. Humans? Rebelling? It was unthinkable. The first reports were dismissed as minor disturbances. When entire outposts went silent, the Zelver fleet was sent to deal with what they assumed were mere insurgents. They found something else entirely. The humans fought with the ferocity of a species that had once ruled its own world through fire and war. They adapted, they learned, and unlike the Dominion's armies, they had nothing left to lose. Each battle was more than a victory, it was a message. The Zelver had turned them into slaves, into shadows of what they had been. But now, the forgotten warriors of Earth were rising again. As word spread, old warriors came out of hiding. Some had lived in secrecy for generations, passing down forbidden knowledge, waiting for the day humanity would rise. They had trained in silence, hidden their strength, feigned submission. Now, they took up arms. The Zelver realized too late that they had not broken Earth's warriors. They had merely forged them into something stronger. Kane led the charge. He had no grand fleet, no planetary strongholds. He had only fire and fury, but that was enough. The Dominion's forces faltered, struggling to contain a rebellion that moved like a phantom. The humans struck from the shadows, vanished into the void, and reappeared where least expected. Zelver commanders, used to crushing lesser races with ease, found themselves overwhelmed. For the first time in centuries, fear crept into the heart of the Dominion. Earth's warriors had returned. The Dominion responded with overwhelming force. Zelver warships descended upon the rebellious systems, their weapons scorching the surface of any world that dared defy them. Entire cities were reduced to ash, their inhabitants slaughtered without mercy. They believed that fear would end the uprising before it could truly begin. But fear was a weapon humans had long since learned to wield against their enemies. Darius Kane stood among his people, watching the skies above Eurythus as the Zelver fleet arrived. He had expected this. He had counted on it. The Dominion wanted to make an example of them, to remind the galaxy that no one could stand against their rule. But Kane had spent his life studying war, and he knew one thing the Zelver did not. A cornered enemy is the most dangerous kind. The fleet deployed its ground forces, marching in perfect formation toward the mines. The Dominion's arrogance was their weakness. They believed they were fighting desperate slaves, not trained warriors who had spent centuries waiting for this moment. The humans did not wait for the enemy to reach them. They struck first. Explosions erupted beneath the Zelver formations as hidden charges tore through their ranks. The tunnels had been rigged, the land turned into a battlefield of Kane's design. The first wave of invaders fell before they could even return fire. Those who survived found themselves in the kill zone. Human snipers, hidden in the jagged rocks, picked off officers with precision. The Zelver forces scrambled for cover, but there was none. Then the true assault began. Humans emerged from the tunnels in disciplined squads, wielding stolen rifles and makeshift weapons. They moved with brutal efficiency, targeting weak points in the Dominion's armor. The Zelver had never fought an enemy like this. They were used to planetary militias, to disorganized riots. But Kane's forces fought like soldiers. Because that was exactly what they were. The battle raged for hours. The Zelver, despite their superior technology, found themselves pushed back. For every human that fell, 3 more took their place. And when the enemy finally attempted to retreat, they discovered the last piece of Kane's plan. Their landing zone had been sabotaged. The humans had cut off their escape, trapping them in the ruins of their own arrogance. Kane walked among the fallen Zelver, his stolen armor marked with the blood of those who had underestimated him. He found their commander, a high-ranking officer struggling to stand. The alien's 4 eyes burned with hatred, but beneath that, Kane saw something else. Fear. "You should have killed us all when you had the chance," Kane said. The commander spat at him. "You think you've won your dust beneath the Dominion's boot." Kane crouched beside him. "Then why are you shaking?" The officer had no answer. Moments later, a human blade ended his life. As the last of the Zelver forces were wiped out, Kane turned to his people. This was just the beginning. The Dominion would send more. They would come with fire and wrath, determined to crush what they had let fester for too long. But Kane had no intention of waiting for them. He sent a message to the scattered human enclaves across the stars. The time for hiding was over. The time for vengeance had begun. The forgotten warriors of Earth were done being slaves. They were done being the remnants of a lost race. Now they would become the storm that would bring the Dominion to its knees. The Zelver Dominion could no longer ignore the threat. Reports flooded in from across their empire, outposts destroyed, supply lines severed, governors assassinated. The humans were no longer slaves. They were warriors once more, and they fought with a vengeance that the Zelver had never encountered. Entire garrisons vanished overnight, their bodies left as grim warnings. Kane had unleashed something the Dominion had never expected. The humans were not just rebelling. They were hunting. The Dominion's War Council convened in secrecy, their towering forms seated around a holographic display showing red clusters spreading like a virus across their controlled systems. The humans were not just attacking military targets. They were striking infrastructure, sabotaging shipyards, turning the Zelver's own technology against them. One of the generals slammed a clawed fist onto the table. They should not have this level of coordination. They are scattered primitive lesser beings. The supreme warlord of the Dominion, clad in ceremonial battle armor, studied the map in silence. His advisors shouted for planetary purges, for orbital bombardments to turn the rebellious worlds into barren wastelands. But he had seen the reports. He had read the last transmissions of dying commanders. They had underestimated humanity once. They would not make that mistake again. "Deploy the executioners," he said. Across the Dominion, the order was relayed. The executioners were the elite, the deadliest warriors in the Zelver military. They had ended countless uprisings, crushed entire civilizations before they could become threats. Their arrival meant one thing: total annihilation. Kane knew they were coming. He had been expecting them. As he stood aboard the bridge of a captured Zelver warship, he watched as reports poured in. The Dominion was moving its most feared warriors into place, ready to strike at the heart of the rebellion. A younger fighter approached him. "Sir, they're sending the executioners." Kane smirked. "Good." The younger man hesitated. "These aren't just soldiers, they're something else." Kane turned to face him. "That's what they said about us too." The warship's stolen communications system crackled to life. A voice, deep and inhuman, echoed through the chamber. "I am Commander Zalvoth of the Executioners. You have taken what is not yours, you will be erased." Kane leaned forward. "You should have done that centuries ago." Then he cut the transmission. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Dominion had seen before. The executioners arrived in force, deploying from the darkness of space like living nightmares. Their black-armored figures descended upon human-controlled worlds, their weapons designed for total extermination. But humanity had been preparing for this moment. Kane had studied the Zelvers' tactics, learned their weaknesses, and now he used that knowledge against them. The executioners were met with fire and steel. The humans fought not as a desperate rebellion but as an organized army. They had adapted, stolen Dominion weapons, hacked their technology, and turned their own strategies against them. The war spread. Planets burned. But for every world the executioners struck, the humans struck two more. And for the first time in recorded history, the executioners lost. On the shattered remains of the industrial world Vekare, Kane stood over the corpse of an executioner commander. The Zelver warrior's black armor was shattered, his lifeless eyes staring into the void. Kane looked up at his soldiers. The battle had been costly, but they had won. And now the galaxy knew the truth. The Zelver were not invincible. Earth's warriors had risen again. And they would not stop until the Dominion was nothing but dust. The Dominion was unraveling. For the first time in its long history, the unchallenged rulers of the galaxy were no longer feared but hunted. Zelver governors abandoned their posts, warships deserted rather than face human forces, and supply chains collapsed as entire planets declared independence. What had begun as a rebellion was now a full-scale war. Kane stood on the bridge of his newest warship, the Vengeance, once the Dominion's pride, now repurposed as humanity's flagship. The ship was a symbol, proof that the Zelver were not untouchable. They had forged chains for humanity, and now those same chains were being used to strangle them. A holographic map flickered before him. Red lines stretched across Dominion space, marking every battle won, every system claimed. His forces were growing. More humans joined with each victory, but they weren't alone. Other species, races once conquered and enslaved, were watching. Some had already reached out in secret, testing the possibility of an alliance. Kane knew they needed more than just human strength. The Dominion was still vast, still powerful. But power meant nothing if fear ruled the minds of those who wielded it. A transmission came through. One of his lieutenants, a hardened warrior named Rhea, appeared on the screen. "We found it," she said. Kane's grip on the console tightened. "Are you sure?" Rhea nodded. "The Dominion's hidden archive. The place where they keep the truth buried. If we take it, we expose everything. Every war crime, every secret, every species they've crushed." Kane exhaled. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The Dominion did not just rule through force. They ruled through control of information. They erased entire civilizations from history, rewriting the past so no one would ever know the truth. "If we do this, there's no going back," Kane said. They'll throw everything they have at us. Rhea smirked. Let them try. The attack was swift and brutal. The hidden archive was located on a heavily fortified moon, buried beneath layers of defenses. The Dominion had never considered it vulnerable. No one had ever dared to strike at the very core of their control. Until now. Kane's fleet emerged from hyperspace like a phantom. The Dominion's defenses barely had time to react before the first wave of attacks tore through their perimeter. Fighters weaved through enemy formations, cutting down warships before they could even power up their weapons. On the surface, Kane led the ground assault. The Zelver forces fought with desperation, but fear had already seeped into their ranks. They knew what was coming. The humans tore through the complex, bypassing security measures, hacking into systems that had never known invasion. They reached the archive's heart. Encrypted files, hidden transmissions, records of every atrocity committed in the Dominion's name. The truth laid bare. Rhea turned to Kane. It's done. Kane looked at the data streaming in. The galaxy would finally see the Zelver for what they were. Tyrants. Liars. Monsters. Transmit it everywhere, he ordered. As the data flooded across the stars, a shift began. Those who had served the Dominion out of fear began to question. Entire planets revolted overnight. Dominion allies withdrew their support. Even within the Zelver's own ranks, fractures began to appear. The Supreme Warlord of the Dominion watched in silence as the reports flooded in. Planets lost. Fleets destroyed. The archive exposed. For the first time in his long reign, he understood the truth. Humanity had not just returned. They were winning. The Dominion was collapsing. Entire sectors had fallen silent as rebellion spread like wildfire. The Zelver war machine, once the undisputed power of the galaxy, now faced a nightmare they could not control. The humans had done more than fight back. They had turned the galaxy itself against its masters. Kane stood in the command center of vengeance, watching the latest reports flood in. Planets that had once been strongholds of Dominion power now flew the banner of rebellion. Formerly enslaved species were rising, inspired by humanity's defiance. Even within the Zelver's own ranks, there were whispers of doubt. Rhea stepped beside him. We're close, they're bleeding. Kane nodded. But they're not finished yet. The Dominion still held its core worlds, their last bastion of power. If they were to be defeated completely, those worlds had to fall. But Kane knew the Supreme Warlord would not surrender. The Zelver ruler had built an empire on dominance and terror. He would burn the galaxy before allowing himself to be defeated. Then we go for the throat, Kane said. The humans prepared for the final assault. Their fleet, once a ragtag group of stolen ships, was now a formidable armada. Allies from across the stars joined them, races once enslaved, now ready to fight. The Dominion's strength had always been its ability to divide and rule. But Kane had done what the Zelver had never thought possible. He had united the broken. The battle for the Zelver homeworld began in fire. The Dominion's last fleets met them in orbit, determined to make humanity pay for every inch of ground. But the humans had learned. They fought not with brute force but with ruthless precision, striking where it hurt most. Zelver ships burned. Their defenses crumbled. And for the first time in history, the skies above the Dominion's throne world were filled with the war cries of those they had once oppressed. Kane led the charge on the surface. His forces landed in the heart of the capital, cutting through the last remnants of the Zelver elite guard. The streets, once symbols of Dominion supremacy, ran red with the blood of their former masters. The Supreme Warlord's palace stood as the last stronghold, its gates locked, its defenders ready to die. Kane approached with his soldiers, standing before the towering fortress. The Zelver leader's voice echoed through the communication lines. You think this is victory, you think you have won. Kane's response was simple. We know we have. The humans breached the palace. The Supreme Warlord fought to the last, his elite warriors refusing to surrender. But their fate had been sealed the moment humanity had risen from the ashes. Cain stood over the broken body of the Dominion's ruler. The war was over. The Zelver were finished. The galaxy was free. But Cain knew the battle was not truly over. Now came the hardest part. Building what came next. The war was over, but the struggle was not. The Dominion had fallen, its fleets shattered, its rulers dead or in hiding. Across the galaxy, planets that had once trembled under Zelver rule now stood free. But freedom brought chaos. With the collapse of the old order, old rivalries resurfaced, warlords seized power, and the fractures of centuries-old oppression threatened to tear everything apart. Cain stood on the bridge of vengeance, watching the galaxy he had helped liberate descend into disorder. The battle had been clear. There had been an enemy, a war to fight, a purpose. Now, the lines were blurred. Some of their former allies sought vengeance, not justice. Others saw opportunity in the power vacuum, eager to carve out their own empires. Rhea approached him, her expression grim. "We're losing control." Cain exhaled. "We never had control." She shook her head. "It's worse than that. Zelver holdouts are rallying their promising protection to the worlds that were once under their rule. They're playing the long game, Cain. If we don't act now, we may have won the war but lost the peace." He had known this would happen. The Dominion had ruled through terror, but it had also provided structure. Now that it was gone, the galaxy was searching for stability, and some were willing to return to their former masters to find it. "Then we give them something better," Cain said. But there was no easy answer. The humans had been the spark that burned down the old order, but they could not rule the galaxy themselves. If they imposed their own leadership, they would become no better than the Dominion. And yet, if they did nothing, all their sacrifices would be for nothing. The leaders of the liberated worlds gathered on the war-torn capital of the Zelver homeworld. They met in the ruins of what had once been the Dominion's Grand Council chambers, a symbol of what had been destroyed and what could be rebuilt. Some wanted a new empire, others wanted independence, and some wanted nothing more than revenge. Cain listened to them argue, his patience wearing thin. He had spent his life fighting, not debating politics. But he knew this was the real battle. If they failed here, the war would never truly end. Enough. Cain's voice cut through the noise. The chamber fell silent. "We did not fight to replace one tyrant with another. We did not bleed and burn just to watch the galaxy fall back into the same cycle. This war wasn't just about humans, it was about all of us, every species that suffered under the Dominion's rule. We can let this collapse into chaos, or we can build something new, something better." A Zelver stood across from him, one of the few who had turned against the Dominion in its final days. "And who decides what is better, you?" Cain shook his head. "No, we all do. It would not be easy. It would take years, maybe lifetimes. But the first step had to be taken. The war had been about destruction. Now came the fight for creation. The first foundations of a new alliance were laid that day. Not an empire, not a dictatorship, but something the galaxy had never seen before, an order built not on fear but on unity. As Cain left the chamber, Rhea walked beside him. "You really think this will work?" Cain looked up at the stars. "It has to." The galaxy was changing. For the first time in history, the old chains were gone. The Dominion was no more, and in its place, something new was beginning to take shape. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was real. Cain stood on the balcony of the former Zelver Palace, now a temporary headquarters for the Alliance forming in the ruins of war. From here, he could see the skyline of the once mighty Dominion capital, now scarred and broken. But beneath the destruction, something else was rising: hope. Rhea joined him, arms crossed as she surveyed the streets below. "The Zelver are still watching us. Some of them don't believe this alliance will last." Cain smirked. "That makes two of us." She chuckled. "And yet you're still here. Because if we walk away now, someone worse will take our place." She nodded, understanding. The galaxy was not won with a single battle. The war had been the easy part. Now came the struggle to keep the peace, to make sure the sacrifices had not been for nothing. The council chambers were filled with representatives from dozens of species, some former enemies, others new allies. Trust was in short supply. Some wanted vengeance, others feared the humans, knowing what they were capable of. But Cain didn't need them to like each other. He just needed them to understand that they had no other choice. A Zelver diplomat, one of the few who had broken from the Dominion before its fall, spoke up. The galaxy remembers humanity as victims. Now they see you as conquerors. What guarantees do we have that you will not become what you fought against? Cain met his gaze. None, except that we know what it's like to be at the bottom. We know what it means to be nothing, and we won't let that happen to anyone else. The words hung in the air. The past could not be erased, and trust could not be built overnight. But it was a start. Outside, ships came and went from the ruined city, carrying messages, supplies, survivors. The rebuilding had begun. Former enemies were working side by side, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. The galaxy had been ruled by fear for too long. Now it would have to learn something new. Cain stepped away from the council chamber, looking up at the endless stars above. Once, humanity had been a scattered, dying people, forgotten by history. Now, they were something more. Not rulers, not tyrants, but a force that had reshaped the destiny of the galaxy. Rhea walked beside him. So what now? Cain exhaled. Now we build. And for the first time in centuries, the future belonged to everyone.